Recording, ready.
Thank you. First, if you can just tell me your name, what do you do, who do you work for? Well, you probably work for.
Okay. Hi, my name is Anne-Claire Howard, and I'm the Executive Director of Bettercoal.
And what does Bettercoal do exactly?
So Bettercoal is a membership organisation. We were founded by European utilities who wanted to ensure that the coal they were buying came from responsible mining companies.
Is this your first time attending this event?
It's actually my second time at the World Coal Leaders Network. I was here 2 years ago. It's changed. I think there's the discussions are probably, there's a bigger sense of urgency in terms of what the coal sector needs to achieve to remain relevant in the future.
Speaking of that, how do you think coal companies are adapting to the pressure to change, to reduce their impact?
I think it's challenging because there's kind of two sides to your question. One side which is around how mining companies in general are adapting to the climate urgency. So we're seeing more investment in general into substituting other fuels for heavy machinery, being more responsible around water management, around fauna and flora preservation. I think for the coal sector there's an additional factor, which obviously it's coal mining. So it's not necessarily linked to the mining activity itself, but there's an emergency around the use of that product further down the value chain. But companies are adapting. We're seeing, at least with the companies Bettercoal works with, we've seen a lot of positive movements around better environmental management of their operations, actually going beyond what the law asks of them. So I think the biggest challenge for companies in general and coal mining companies in particular is you're operating in very different jurisdictions. For instance, the laws around coal mining in Germany are very different to the laws in Russia or in the United States or even in Indonesia. So some companies will choose to operate purely within the legal framework. Other companies will go beyond what's required, and we're seeing that more and more.
What would you say are the key elements to a responsible supply chain?
That's an even harder question. I think the key thing around any supply chain is looking at the whole value chain. We tend to focus a lot of attention at the two endpoints. So obviously when it comes to coal, there's the miners. So it's around how you're a responsible mining company, how you apply principles around environmental, social and governance preservation at the mine. And then obviously there's the end user. So for instance for coal it'll be steel manufacturers or cement or the power companies. They are usually governed by a set of laws around mostly carbon emissions, which is the most relevant part of the value chain for them when it comes to environmental responsibility. But we forget sometimes that there's a whole value chain in the middle. The coal doesn't miraculously go from the supplier to the end user. There are export terminals, import terminals, railways, boats, all sorts of modes of transport. And the most important piece in the whole equation is traders. Obviously, some users will buy directly from the mining company, so you know where your product is coming from, and therefore you have some visibility on the performance of that company. As soon as you introduce trading into the mix, you lose that traceability of product. You don't necessarily know where the product is coming from, how it was bought, where it was manufactured. You sometimes find out after you've done the deal, but that means that you're removing a transparency layer in that supply chain. So responsible supply chain for me for coal is where every node in the value chain knows where the product comes from, how it was produced, and at each stage you can know how it's impacting the environment or impacting labor or impacting basic human rights.
Do you think, this is my own question, do you think things like blockchain and this type of technology can bring more transparency? What do you think is the solution to bring this transparency?
I think blockchain is working really well in other commodities. So you're seeing it applied to cobalt, lithium, other commodities that are very important for the revolution we're going through, moving to electric vehicles, etc. I think for coal, transparency can be resolved without having a recourse to blockchain. You're not finding a lot of people smuggling coal around, putting it in their pockets, and you lose the traceability side. Coal is in such huge volumes that you know at least which country or which region it's coming from. I think the key thing is to understand how the traders can contribute to actually helping ensure that responsibility across the chain. I don't think that there's a willingness to be untransparent. You can always find out where coal has come from. I think that the trick is finding the parts in the value chain where you can lose that traceability a little bit. Blockchain would be great, if you literally put a barcode on every lump of coal that's going through the system, but that's never going to happen. The cost would be, I can't even imagine how much it would cost, and it probably wouldn't resolve much of the problems anyway. I think that communication and transparency, by just having the different actors agree on what's important, would be much more powerful than modern blockchain technology.
Fair enough. Back to sustainability, who do you think are currently the leaders when it comes to reducing their environmental impact?
It's hard because I think you can't pinpoint a single company. I think in the companies we've worked with, we've seen companies that are making a lot of progress. So recently we've been working a lot with Russian coal producers, and a lot of them were underperforming when it came to environmental matters, especially around biodiversity or relationship with their local communities, water management. But we're seeing that there's actually a strong desire from these companies to perform better. So what we're seeing now is, following the work we've been doing with them, we're seeing these companies go actually beyond what the law asks of them. So they're doing more than what's legally required, and they're actually investing to perform better. So there's a recognition that, sometimes better environmental practices are actually good for business. It's not a money pit that you're just putting, sinking investment into. It's about being a better company, and it's actually working quite well. But yeah, we're seeing, a lot of companies, as soon as we've done our assessments with them and put in place their improvement plans, there's usually a desire from the plant managers, from the mining operators to put those plans in place. Because no one wants to work in a company where you're not performing as well as you could be. I think the real challenge in the coal industry more broadly is around the investments that are needed to meet those thresholds of high performance. And we're seeing that in some countries, access to finance is becoming an issue. Or in some companies, the government simply isn't interested in investing in better performance. So that's the biggest challenge, is when you get to the stage where companies want to improve, but they don't have the financial resources or the capability in terms of know-how or technology to actually put these improvements in place. And that's where it gets really frustrating.
And from your perspective, from what you know, how do you see coal developing over the next 5-10 years? What's the future of coal in Europe specifically?
In Europe, I think coal for power generation, there's a very clear downward trend, and a downward trend which we all foresaw. If you look at the IEA projections for Europe, they've never been positive. I think what's surprised everyone is how quickly the downturn has happened, and how quickly, first of all, the price of gas has had a massive influence on this. So in the UK, for instance, you've seen a big displacement of coal with gas or biomass or other sources of energy. It's not necessarily the renewables are now occupying a bigger space in the market, it's just that gas has become so cheap, it's made it easy to remove coal from the equation. In the rest of Europe, I think there's very clear now government policies around the phase out of coal. Most European countries have a clear date for when they will exit coal for power generation, and that leaves coal for manufacturing, steel, cement, and other processes. The risk is that these operations may be displaced out of Europe in order for European Union countries to meet their ambitions of being carbon neutral. So I think there will be a sharp decline. I think the decline may happen quicker than anticipated. I think for me the key questions around coal in Europe are, first of all, companies choosing to divest their assets as opposed to close them down, which I think is irresponsible. At the end of the day, if a country has a set date for the coal phase out, what we're seeing is some companies choosing to sell off that asset so they don't have to deal with what happens afterwards. I think that's one of the big problems. And the second big issue is around countries in Europe that aren't just coal consumers but also coal producers. So for Germany, Poland, places like that, there's a double challenge, which is, first of all, electricity production from coal, which will inevitably end. But then what happens to the whole economy that's been built around coal mining, coal utilization? And there it's about finding the mechanisms to ensure what we call a just energy transition.